Today I'll be looking at the religious authority of Aga Khan IV, who is the grandson of Aga Khan III, whom Faraz has already discussed with us. And I'm specifically interested in looking at how contemporary Ismaili Muslim ritual practice depicts and demonstrates the kind of authority that Aga Khan IV has within the Ismaili community. And before I launch into that, I just need to make some preliminary remarks about this notion of authority, the authority of the Imamate in Shi'i Islam. So the Prophet Muhammad, for Muslims, and most Muslims recognize that the Prophet Muhammad's role does include serving as a conduit by which the Quran is revealed to humankind, but it also includes a number of other roles. For example, if we take the Quran itself as simply a historical document that reflects the experience of the Prophet and the early community, we find that the Prophet Muhammad was also someone who possessed authority in general on behalf of God himself. So the often countered phrase in the Quran, he who obeys the messenger obeys God. We also find that the Prophet Muhammad was the interpreter of the Quran, the one who decided how the Quranic ethos and the Quranic vision was to be implemented at a practical everyday level. We also find that the Prophet Muhammad, as the Quran describes in verse 464 and verse 9103, served as an intercessor, an intermediary between God and the believers when it came to specific things like the believers obtaining God's forgiveness and offering their repentance. So in general, the Prophet Muhammad possessed a number of spiritual functions that go beyond the delivery of revelation. And Shia Muslims believe, and the Imami Shia in particular, that the authority of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as all these extra prophetic functions that I just mentioned, continue through an office of succession called the Imamate. And that in accordance with this principle of succession, the Prophet Muhammad appointed his cousin and son-in-law Ali ibn Abi Talib as his successor to all these spiritual duties and functions. And that thereafter, Ali appointed his son to be his successor, and that son appointed his son. So there is a specific line of descendants who continue the religious authority of the Prophet Muhammad, and that entire that lineage of descendants are referred to as the Imams. And as Faraz already mentioned, Shia Muslims would then differ over the identity of a particular Imam. So the Ismailis believe that the legitimate line of Imams by direct appointment continues among the descendants of Ismail, son of Jafar Sadiq. Other Shias, of course, disagree. And it's through this long history of about 1400 years that the Ismailis today recognize His Highness Aga Khan IV, otherwise known as Shakrim al-Husayni, as the 49th hereditary Imam in a direct unbroken lineage going back to Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Imam, through the line of Ismail, for which they're known as Ismailis. Why is this important in general? It's important, I believe, because the Nizari Ismailis, whom we're discussing now, are actually the only community that is led by a Imam who is present and living. This contrasts with the case of the Twelver Shia, who are the majority of Shia, who believe in a hidden Imam, that the Imam has been hidden for about 1200 years and is represented by different scholarly classes of people. It differs from the Dawoodi Bohras and other Bohras for whom the Imam is also hidden. So just in general, the Nizari Ismailis represent a very interesting case study of authority in Islam. So the current Imam functions both as the spiritual guide and the interpreter of Islam for his particular community, as well as someone who plays a major role on the international stage. The current Aga Khan is the founder and chairman of the Aga Khan Development Network, a vast network of development institutions who collectively aim to uplift the human quality of life in a number of different areas, such as healthcare, such as education, such as culture, such as architecture, such as poverty alleviation. So this has made studying the authority of the current imam in modern scholarship a little bit difficult because, frankly, this imam plays so many different roles at once. So what we found actually, and if I may do a very quick literature review, a lot of the studies have actually focused on the Aga Khan's role as the head of the AKDN. So a lot of the studies, such as Karim H. Karim's study, have really focused on the AKDN. Jonah Steinberg's 2011 book was a study of the Ismaili community worldwide, just spread through 25 different countries as a transnational community, as a global corporate. And it's only in 2014 that Daryush Pur of the Institute of Ismaili Studies published a book, Authority Without Territory, which actually looked at the authority of the Ismaili Imam, but also with a focus on the AKDN as an institution, as the embodiment of that authority. So Pur's conclusions sort of inform what I am doing in my project. Pur concluded that the Aga Khan's authority is hybrid or kaleidoscopic because it embraces both material and spiritual matters. He concluded that in modern times, as a break from the past, the person of the imam is being de-emphasized and the institution of the imamate, as well as the embodiment of that institution in bodies like the AKDN, is being emphasized. And in that course of events, Pur proposes that theological frames are being replaced amongst the Ismailis with a more developmental focus. He also showed, quite importantly, that the ideal types of authority proposed by Max Weber, which pretty much form the basis of studies of authority in Islam and many other faith traditions, Pur concluded that Weber's ideal types are insufficient for capturing the authority, the kind of authority that the Ismaili Imam has. So my work sort of looks at this, and as a starting point, I note that all this scholarship so far excludes Ismaili Muslim ritual practice in relation to the Ismaili Imam's authority. In fact, I've noted that this scholarship, for the most part, is talking about the Aga Khan's authority using publicly available texts and documents without looking into the role the Aga Khan plays amongst his own Ismaili community. So that's what I'm trying to get at, and therefore I decide to look to Ismaili ritual practice as a manifestation of the Ismaili Imam's authority today. This just goes to show the Aga Khan is someone who wears many hats today. And methodologically, if we only study the Imam wearing certain hats and not other hats, I think we're going to be missing something. And this is a situation that my study hopes to rectify. So, what am I focusing on, and why am I focusing on it? Jonah Steinberg, in his study of the global Ismaili community, did note that, and to quote him, among religious elements of Ismaili life, none is more central than devotion to the Imam. Such devotion is the single most significant fact of Ismaili religion. It could be described, in fact, as itself constitutive of Ismailism. He goes on to say that devotion to the Imam is the most essential act in life. Now, Jonah Steinberg, of course, is talking about the community. When you study the community, this is what you find. Nevertheless, I think he has pointed out a very, very important point, and it's this devotional, spiritual dimension of the living Imam's authority that prior scholarship has not touched on yet. So how will I be dealing with this? Well, firstly, how do we study authority? How do we frame authority? Well, the prior study by Daryush Pur argued quite well that the Weberian ideal types, the three ideal types that people are familiar with, traditional, rational, legal, and charismatic, are insufficient for looking at the Aga Khan's authority as a whole. But I'm looking at the Aga Khan's authority with respect to the Ismaili community and the Ismaili Tariqah. So I'm looking at a specific facet of the Aga Khan's authority. And therefore, I think that Max Weber's charisma type, which is defined here on the slide, can provide a useful lens. I will not argue it's fully sufficient, but I think Weberian charisma can be useful for us as a lens, as something that helps us focus our efforts. So that's one methodological consideration that my study has taken into account. Secondly, we don't have to just use Eurocentric approaches to authority. And that's what Max Weber himself is guilty of. So I point to the concept of Walayah, which some recent scholars have shed light upon. The concept of Walayah, a notion of authority, but also meaning more than that, operative in the early Imami Shi'i context from the 7th century onward. So according to Amir Moezi and De Cake, the term Walayah in the Shiite context includes 3 different facets. Number 1, it refers to the Imam's spiritual power, sanctity, and proximity to God. Number 2, as a result of that, Walayah also refers to the Imam's all-encompassing authority over the believers. And thirdly, the term Walayah is also used to refer to the believer's love, devotion, and loyalty to the Imam. So Walayah is this multivalent concept. And I would also point to Walayah as a consideration in my study alongside Weberian charisma. And you can already see there's an overlap between Weberian charisma and the Imami Shi'i concept of Walayah. So my study then seeks to understand how the authority of the present Ismaili Imam, corresponding to these 2 ideas, charisma and Walayah, could find expression in contemporary Ismaili ritual practices. Why did I choose this? I noted that some other studies, for example, the study I've quoted here, have looked at authority of the Shi'i Imams in non-Ismaili traditions, and they've looked at ritual as a manifestation of that type of authority. So my point is that why can't we use a similar method for the case of the Ismaili Imam? So I've talked about authority. Now, what about ritual? There are, many of you know, there's a lot of literature on ritual theory, and different theories of ritual lend themselves to different methods of studies. I have decided to look at ritual the way Wheelock looks at ritual. According to Wheelock, ritual language serves a declarative purpose. It does not serve a communicative purpose. So ritual is not really about the participant actually communicating with some deity or supernatural being, according to Wheelock. Ritual actually is supposed to declare a situation. According to Wheelock, that situation that ritual declares is a paradigm or archetype that expresses the fundamental values and most important lessons of a religious tradition. Now, when it comes to Ismaili ritual, then, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the textual aspects of Ismaili rituals. And just a word, the ritual practices of the Ismaili Muslims today do differ from place to place, from community to community. There is a great deal of diversity, but there are some rituals, a handful of them, that are common to Ismailis around the world, with only minor differences. What's most important for us is that, in general, the Ismaili Imam prescribes and authorizes contemporary Ismaili ritual practices through a sort of bureaucratic institutional framework. But the point is that Ismaili ritual practices today do not simply reflect what the community may believe or think. They do reflect what the living Imam has authorized to be declared about the nature of his own authority. And that's why I believe looking at the texts, so looking at the recitations, the language, the ritual language of Ismaili ritual does tell us something about the authority of the living Imam of the Ismailis. Now, as a caveat, because there will be questions, I did not study how individual Ismailis may interpret the rituals. I did not look at how ritual affects the mindset of the community, whether it's effective or not. I did not use ethnography as a method. I used a textual approach, and one reason I chose this method is that Ismaili Muslim ritual practices today are private. a non-Ismaili cannot enter. And therefore, to preserve that sense of privacy and decorum, I deliberately avoided methods that would intrude on that. Instead, I use a textual approach because there are texts, publications that talk about these rituals that contain, what is recited in the ritual language. And frankly, for my purpose, it's not about what community members may feel or think. It's really about how the authority of the Aga Khan, of the Imam, is presented and depicted within the community. And I think rituals do that for us. So what I'm going to sort of show is that the Ismaili rituals today create a ritual situation through the language that's used. And in general, this ritual situation articulates, presents the Ismaili Imam's authority. Several authors, if I may note, already do this. Paula Sanders, Buehler, Takim, Shafiq Virani, Jonah Steinberg to a certain degree does it. So what I'm doing is nothing new. It's only new in the sense that it has not been done for the contemporary Ismaili community, at least not yet. So this then is my thesis, that these ritual practices of contemporary Ismaili Muslims depict, situate, and ultimately embody the Walayah, the authority of the Ismaili Imam. In fact, I'll conclude that Ismaili ritual practice today constitutes the main avenue in which the Imam's Walayah is communicated and presented to his murids, to Ismailis. So now I'll just go through a few examples, and there are more in my paper, but the time won't allow us to go through all of them, but I'll just go through a few examples of these rituals that I think serve the point that I'm making. So to begin, Ismaili Muslim rituals as a whole fall under the category of Tariqah. They do not fall under the category of Sharia, and that's why they're private. That's why they don't take place in a mosque. They take place in a Jamaat Khana, which is a private space. And one becomes an Ismaili Muslim through a ritual act known as bay'ah. Bay'ah in Arabic means buying and selling. The ritual of bay'ah actually goes back to the very origins of the Ismaili movement in the 7th, 8th century, and based on the texts we have, we do find the bay'ah ritual being practiced at that time. Today, the constitution of the Ismaili Muslims describes bay'ah as the act of acceptance by the murid, that is the Ismaili Muslim, of the permanent spiritual bond between the Imam and the murid. And the bay'ah is further described as embodying the loyalty, devotion, obedience, and allegiance to the Imam. Already here, we can see the language is quite reminiscent of the classical concept of Walayah, because one of the definitions of Walayah in the classical period was the believer's love, loyalty, devotion to the Imam. And when a new Ismaili Muslim actually makes that bay'ah, he or she declares that, absolute faith, spiritual allegiance, devotion, and loyalty to the Imam of the time and his successors. So sort of already at the level of bay'ah, which is the initiation ritual, there is a expression of the kind of authority that the Ismaili Imam has. It is an authority that commands obedience, devotion, loyalty, faith, and love. Now we can move on to another example, and that's the example of the Ismaili Muslim daily prayer, an Arabic prayer known as the dua. This dua consists of 6 parts. Each part consists of Quranic verses, supplications, a declaration of Shakrim al-Husayni as the living Imam, and a prostration to God. And I'll just point to 2 examples from this dua. So there are Quran verses recited in the dua, and almost all of the Quran verses, if you look back in pre-modern literature, have been understood by the Ismaili community as references to the Imam. So 2 examples of those Quran verses which you find in part 2 of the Ismaili dua. The first one here commands the believers to obey God, obey the Prophet, and obey the possessors of authority and the ulul amr, and that is understood by the community of the past and the present to refer to the Imam. So the reciting that verse in ritual is actually saying something about the kind of authority the living Imam possesses within his community. And that's just the example that I'll use. But it goes beyond authority in the sense of obedience. so what we get from here so far is the Imam's authority within the Ismaili community is entitled to absolute obedience, because the very position of the Imam theologically is understood to be a divinely ordained position and not a mere human construct or a mere human tradition. But further in the Ismaili dua, we find certain supplications where the Imam is mentioned and invoked as a means or conduit of God's blessings. So in part 3 of the dua, the Ismaili Muslim will declare the following: to seek help by means of your present and living master, Shaykh al-Husayni. The word in Arabic, tawassalu, relates to a particular verse of the Quran that I've put on the slide here, which tells Muslims to be conscious of God and seek the medium, wasila, unto God. And the prayer that you see above, and another instance of that sort of prayer, is in part 5 of the dua, where the murid is also seeking the Imam as a means of blessings. Both of these instances situate the Ismaili Imam, the living Ismaili Imam, as the wasila, as the means of access or the medium of God's help and blessings. And it's interesting to note that we have Ismaili texts going back 1,000 years to the 11th century where Ismaili scholars quote this verse to even make a case for the existence of a living Imam. And the community's prayers continue through this sort of language to allude to this sort of Quran verse. There's even another ritual which I won't get into much detail on, but there are other rituals that are performed in the space of the Ismaili Jamaat Khana, where an Ismaili Muslim will regularly approach the ceremonial representative of the Imam and seek the Imam's blessings for forgiveness, for spiritual purification. He may submit an offering, and the Imam's representative, known as a Mukhi Sahib, will then invoke the Imam's prayers and blessings for that person. So this ritual is a bit different. It's more dialectical in the sense that there's two people participating in it. But once again, the ritual, all these rituals here are doing what Wheelock calls engendering a situation. And that situation is communicating the kind of authority the Ismaili Imam holds within his community. The last thing I'll talk about very quickly is an occasion where the Ismaili Imam will meet a gathering of Ismailis, usually in a closed private space, but sometimes this happens publicly in certain countries. But this is a very special occasion, and it's called a didar. So a didar, the word means sight or vision or glimpse, but a didar is a special audience that the Ismaili Imam will have with his followers. This is a very, very important occasion. So what will happen is, and I'll just give you an example. This is a photo of the Ismaili Imam back in 1960 giving didar in Hunza. And what's going on here is the Imam will first walk amongst the crowd that has gathered, and everyone at the didar will be reciting a special benediction known as salawat. A salawat is a prayer in which the blessings of God are invoked upon Prophet Muhammad and his descendants, in this case referring to the Imam. So as the Imam will walk, the salawat will be chanted. And once again, some of these take place in public, which is why I can freely talk about this. And this didar will also include the Imam ascending a stage, and from that stage the Imam will give an impromptu address called a farman. And that farman will be transcribed on that very occasion, and later it will be read across Jamaat Khanas around the world. So the text of that farman will be read. What's interesting is, and I can't get into the details, but what's going on here, the fact that there is salvat, the fact that there is a farman, and in that farman the Imam will refer to those gathered, the members of his community, as his beloved spiritual children, which also says something about the kind of authority the Ismaili Imam has within the community. But what everything going on in the didar is engendering a certain situation, a ritual situation. The last thing to keep in mind, there's an idea that underlies all Ismaili practices today. That idea is the notion that the Imam, theologically speaking, is the bearer or the manifestation of a spiritual light, a spiritual reality, which today is called often the light of Imamat. Those who have studied Ismaili intellectual history will find that Ismaili thinkers going back 1,000 years have given many descriptions of the light of Imamate as a universal spiritual reality that God originates before the creation of the world and through which God creates, sustains, and guides all beings in the universe. In different Ismaili traditions, the light of Imamat has been given different names, such as the universal intellect in the Neoplatonic context, the word or command of God in the Quranic context. In Sufi discourses, the light of Imamat is called the Muhammadan reality or the Muhammadan light. What's important, I thought, is I quickly checked the farmans of the prior Imam, Aga Khan III, and the current Imam, Aga Khan IV, and you do find a consistent mention of the Imam as the bearer of light in contemporary farmans of the Imam, which shows us that the idea of the Imam as bearer of light is still a important current concept in contemporary Ismaili discourse. In fact, in a 1965 interview that the Aga Khan gave, he actually said quite clearly to the interviewer, when he was asked about his status to the community, the Imam said, "I have been the bearer of the Nur, a word which means the light. The light has been handed down in direct descent from the Prophet." I bring this up because ultimately all Ismaili rituals, especially the didar, for the community then offer one a chance to have contact with not just the person of the Imam, but with that pre-eternal light of Imamat, which, by the way, is a concept not just in Ismailism, but it's a concept that permeates much of esoteric Muslim discourse, especially Sufism. So finally, to conclude, then, I believe that contemporary Ismaili rituals certainly depict and express the Ismaili Imam's authority in theological terms, and I've gone through examples of that. I believe, therefore, that my findings would revise some of the conclusions of current scholarship. For example, Dariushpur, who I already mentioned, said in his book that the heavy theological crust is becoming increasingly thinner and replaced with a more developmental outlook, and that there's a shift of emphasis from the person of the Imam to the office of the Imamate. I believe that what Dariushpur says may be true for public discourses, but I do not believe that it holds true for Ismaili ritual practices. According to my analysis, what we see are two discourses in contemporary Ismailism, two discourses about the Imam, a public discourse and a private discourse, or in other words, an institutional discourse and a ritual discourse. These coexist. We can easily reconcile them if we hold in mind the very old principle that we find among Ismailis, the idea of zahir and batin, otherwise known as exoteric and esoteric. So to conclude, I'll just read the final paragraph that I had in my paper. When understood in a comprehensive and holistic manner, the contemporary situation of the Ismaili Imamat features two distinct discourses of authority, a public or Zahiri discourse and a private or Batini discourse. Today it is the Zahiri discourse of the Ismaili Imamate as presented in the Imam's speeches, interviews, and institutional activities that shifts towards a developmental and ethical focus. Meanwhile, the Imam's Batini discourse, consisting of the theological and metaphysical expressions of his authority, is expressed in the community's ritual practice as analyzed in this study. To put it more succinctly, the ethical Zahir has become institutionalized while the theological Batin has become ritualized, and yet these two different discourses of authority continue to find confluence in the single person of the Ismaili Imam. Thank you very much.